Hello friends, welcome. Friends, yesterday the CPI numbers of November 23 was out. Now friends, what I am planning to do in this presentation is that not only we will look at the absolute inflation numbers and the trends, what we are observing over a period of time, but we are planning to focus on comparing the two economics of India, which is urban versus rural. And we will see that how the inflation numbers of both these economies are changing over a period of time and how they compare with each other. Now, friends, while doing so, I am going to adopt a different approach. Normally, whenever you are comparing inflation, you are looking at absolute numbers. So, what I mean by absolute number, what I basically mean by absolute number is that what is the absolute inflation, not only of the combined inflation, which is the general index, but the absolute inflation of the individual items which contribute to the general index. Like for example, let's say if I choose here and say combined inflation, what is the inflation numbers, and you see that the inflation numbers of combined inflation that was announced yesterday was 5.55, and individual items where the inflation of individual items are here. You can see this, like for example, fruits is 10.95%, pulses is 20.23%, spices is 25.55%, etc. Now, friends, looking at these absolute numbers is not very useful. The reason is that every item has a weight, and this weight is the contribution of this particular item to the general index. So, even if the inflation of a particular item may be very high, if the weight of that particular item is low. For example, if you look at spices, the inflation is very high of 21.55%. The weight is only 2.5% to the overall general index, and therefore this contribution of this inflation may not be very significant to the overall inflation. So it does not give a very clear and very definitive perception as to how this item is affecting the overall index. So what I have done is that instead of using the absolute index, absolute inflation, I am using a weighted average inflation. So what I mean by weighted average, the weighted average basically means that what is the percentage contribution. Like if you look at the spices, the inflation of absolute inflation of spices was 21.55, but the weighted average contribution of spices is only 59.9 basis point, right? Whereas in case of vegetable, the contribution is 106.9 basis point, which basically means out of this 555 basis point, 106 it contributes to 555.24 basis point. So the contribution of vegetable in the overall index is significant because of the weight versus the inflation of vegetable in that particular segment, right? So that is how I am going to compare. Now, in this presentation, rather than comparing the overall number and the trend, which we'll definitely look into it, but what I am thinking is that it will be useful to see how both the markets, both the economics of India, which is urban versus rural, compare with each other. So what I am planning to do is I am going to use the urban inflation weighted average and will compare that with the rural inflation weighted average, which will give us a very good picture as to what is going on, right? So friends, let's start and see the difference, because on the left hand side of your screen you will see urban inflation weighted average matrix, and on the right hand side of your screen you will see the rural inflation weighted average matrix, right? Now friends, first observation that anyone can do here by looking at the general index, you will find that it is a very startling fact that the rural inflation has been significantly higher. Means it not significantly, it's always been higher compared to the urban inflation. If you compare each and every month, for example, if you compare the last month, you will find that the rural inflation has been 5.84%, urban inflation here is 5.25%. Similarly, recently, in the recent trend, I find it very strange that rural inflation has been shown as higher. It is seen as higher compared to urban inflation, which kind of points to a very important factor that there is some problem with the rural side of the economy on both supply as well as demand side. So that has to be fixed, right? So this is a very important observation that we are making here. The second important observation that we are making here is that some of the items, for example, vegetables, it is kind of very I don't know how to basically describe this, that vegetable, the access to vegetable should be, right, intuitively much more easier for the rural people, right? But you will find that whenever you look at inflation, you'll find that the vegetable inflation is completely resonating compared, if you compare both the markets, the urban market and the rural market, you say that it kind of resonates, as if that it is in symphony, which looks to me a little bit of strange, right? Like for example, if you see that in July 23, the total inflation was 7.19%, and in case of urban inflation, the contribution of the vegetables to the overall 719 number was 183.6 basis points. Similarly, if you look at July 23, 763 of the total 763 basis point, the contribution to vegetable from a rural economy perspective was 258.4 basis point, which is very high. So this is a very important, very strange kind of observation that I noticed, that it is quite counterintuitive that vegetable is an item which should have been a much more easy to access from a supply side point of view, because the rural people are much nearer to farms, but it is still showing a very significant contribution to the rural inflation. So there is definitely some issues that we have to deal with, right, here. Similarly, if you look at the larger trend, what we see today in India is that only difference between rural and urban is housing, because in rural, housing does not form part of the index, it has been left out, whereas in urban, housing forms a part of the index, and it kind of contributes to a larger portion of the overall inflation number. For example, if you see here in November 2022, housing basically contributed to 100 basis point of the total inflation of 567 basis point, whereas rural, this number is absent. So that's the difference which we can see. The rest of the things, if you look at each and every item like cereals and products, you'll find rural also the cereal and products numbers are resonating as if it was resonating in the urban. Now, from a contribution point of view, cereal product to the overall inflation looks less, right, compared to what you see in case of the rural market. The reason is that, what I believe is, because the housing item is absent in case of rural, therefore the contribution of cereal from the overall weight, if you see, is 12.35%, whereas in case of urban it is 6.59%. That is why this is almost double. So that's the only difference here. If housing was captured here and housing contributed to the rural inflation number, then this weight would not have been 12.35%. So that's how these numbers are basically showing up as a higher contributing factor to the overall inflation. Okay, so that is what we see here. And rest of the item, like for example, if you see fuel and light, it is expected that the fuel and light would be contributing similarly between rural and urban, because from a supply and the demand point of view, this is almost similar in nature. There is no difference between the two markets, right? So this is the overall picture which emanates out of the when you compare rural and urban. So what I find here, which is also very interesting, is that within this 12-month window, right, because starting from November 22 and November 23, oil and fat has been showing a decreasing trend. Like if you look at from April 23 to November 23, it has basically pulled down, it has helped to pull down the overall inflation number. Like in November 23 for urban, it is pulling down the overall inflation number by 36.4 basis point, whereas in rural it is pulling down the overall inflation number by 67.9 basis point, right, which is very significant. So that is one very interesting trend that we are noticing here in this number. Now let's go back in time. So I am going to put a number of 12 months back in time. So I'll put 12 here and I'll put 12 here. So both back in time, let's compare what is going on. So back in time, 12 months from now, that is, we are comparing the window of November 21 to November 22, we find that the inflation was much higher. So everything is showing up as red, and the vegetable inflation was dominating the overall inflation, as well as the housing numbers were very high. Whereas in the rural side, you find that the cereal and product prices actually were low at the start of this window period, and it started increasing. If you see, but for both urban and rural, the contribution of cereal products are much more higher to the overall index. I'll just bring the window back so that you notice the trend on both the sides. You'll find that the cereal prices actually have started increasing beginning November 21, right? Because now you see it's showing a rising trend. It is not basically slowing down. It's still rising. It's continuously rising. On the rural side, the contribution is much higher, though it has been a slightly plateaued, in this November 23, but the trend has been increasing. Now let's go back again in that same window period and see what's going on. So we find that the trends are almost same. Oil and fat, here also the oil and fat, the prices basically went down, it is going down, and now it has basically gone down. So the government of India has been able to contain oil and fat very significantly, but the cereal and product has gone out of hand, right? The housing is anyway, is a big contributor to the urban inflation, and the transport and communication, because of the rising fuel prices, in the initial part of this particular window, which is November 21 to November 22, transport and communication basically contributed significantly to the urban inflation. It's very clearly evident from here. Like, look at these numbers, and you'll find transport and communication, the weight is also very high. It contributed significantly, whereas in rural, the weight is not very, very high. So it is high, but it is not as significant. Other interesting thing is that if you see, still here you see the rural inflation numbers are higher compared to the urban inflation numbers, which is again a very, very serious issue which we have to basically look into, because we really don't like the rural inflation to be higher, because the rural markets have lower disposable income. There the prices should be much stable, because the basic necessities of life like food, etc., should be much nearer to the people, and therefore supply side constraint should be much lower as far as rural is concerned, which is very counterintuitive, which looks to me very strange. Okay, let's go back but 24 months back in time on both the windows, and let's see what's happening. So in 24 months back in time, the oil and fat prices were very high, but cereal products were under control. Look at this. So the oil and fats, like basically oil fat went down in the current window, the cereal and products prices basically went up, and that has disturbed the overall equilibrium of the inflation number. So that is very interesting to note here. Whereas the fuel and light, we expected that the oil prices were very high, the fuel and lighter prices, and the transportation was also contributing to a large part of the inflation 24 months back. Now let's look at 36 months back in time on both the windows, and let's see what's going on. So in 36 months back in time, the inflation numbers basically largely uniformly contributed to though the inflation numbers were very high, but not a single item added significantly to the inflation except transport and communication. See, transport and communication. Here the vegetable numbers basically were very higher in the initial part of the window, November 19. Here you see. But rest of the items were more or less similar in nature. Their contribution was more or less similar, though the overall inflation numbers were very high. But not a single item stood out as a significant contributor except transport and communication, right? So that's the characteristics of the inflation 36 months back in time. Let's look at 48 months back in time. Let's see what was the situation then. So the 48 months back in time, the vegetable prices basically added to the inflation, though the inflation numbers were quite low at that particular point of time. See, look at this particular window. They were not very high in the initial part of the window, November 18 till November 19. November 19, the number shot up, but before that, the rural inflation numbers were quite low, which was very, very good, and the vegetable prices were much low. So it looks to me that after November 19, has been some disturbance, there is a significant disturbance which has taken place. That has resulted in the rural economy's inflation going very, very high, which was not the case in this particular window. Look at this window, November 18 to November 19. The rural inflation numbers are much lower than the urban general index inflation numbers, right? So there has been some characteristics changes which has happened in the rural economy that needs to be fixed. Without that, we are going to harm the interest of the people. So these are the things which are required to be looked into when we look at inflation numbers, right? Without looking at the trend, it does not mean anything. because we need to see what we were in past, where we are now. Then only we will be able to make those corrections, right? We have to learn from our mistakes, or learn from our experience what we did correctly in past, so that we can replicate those things in future, so that we can contain the inflation, and so that we can improve the lives of the people. Now let's look back again in time in 60 months back in time, and let's see what was the situation then. So here we find the inflation numbers were high, not very high, but they were reasonably high, and the rural numbers were almost comparable to the urban numbers, right? And what contributed to the overall inflation? The vegetable prices. Look at this. The vegetable prices, as far as rural is concerned, is a major contributor to the inflation, which to me is very strange. So in India, one of the perishable items like vegetable is contributing to a large part of the inflation in rural India, which is very strange. And in urban also it is contributing, but the urban, since the weights are different, therefore it does not give that kind of a flavor to the overall index as far as vegetables are concerned. Housing prices, look at the housing prices. Housing prices significantly contributed to the overall urban inflation, around from November 17 to November 18. Which is also very interesting to note, right? And then the transport prices were also reasonably fine, that's okay. Let's look back 72 months back in time and see what was the situation then, and how the inflation numbers basically compared. So 72 months back in time, the housing numbers were high, the vegetable numbers were controlled, pulses and products were much lower compared to what it is today, as far as the and it looks like that again here in the rural market, though inflation numbers were not very high, and interestingly, if you look at this particular window, the urban inflation numbers are lower than that of the rural inflation, right? In general, right? No, it may not be for all the months. Some of the months it are lower. For example, if you look at July 17, it is lower, and then the rural is higher. And in some of the months it is higher, and some of the months it is lower. So it is not that it's like not showing any pattern here, right? Yeah. So in, like, for example, November 17, the urban is 490.27, the rural was 479.07. But the pattern really emerges in the initial months, that the rural inflation has increased. So there has been some kind of issue that we have to fix as far as rural economy is concerned. Now let's go back to around 84 months back in time and see what was the situation then. 84 months. So here we find that pulses and products basically started showing up, contributing to housing was a very important factor as far as urban inflation is concerned. And in rural, the vegetable prices was contained. In the urban also, the vegetable prices were contained. So look at this. The vegetable prices is not reflecting and contributing to the same amount of inflation in every window of period that we are looking into. Why? That we have to ask this question, why it is like this? Why there is one item standing out? Why we are not able to fix the supply side and the demand side of these items? This is the policy issue that we have to handle, right? To make sure that, because if we are able to contain a particular period, the prices of a particular period, then the same should have been reflected in the other period also. If there is a monsoon issue, that I can understand, there could be some issues as far as the monsoon is concerned. The prices may not have, the products may not have been, the farm, there must be damage to the farming effort of the farmers. That part I can understand. But I don't recollect that there has been a major monsoon disturbance which took place in the period which we are looking at right now, right? Monsoons was reasonably, uniform within this particular period, except this particular year, where because of the El Nino factor, I don't think that there was a disturbance in monsoon. So let's look back by another 12 months period, which is 96 months from now. Window period of 96. Let's see what was the situation then. Here also the housing prices continuously stood out. And here I find that the fuel and light contributed, the pulses and product basically stood out. So there have been a lot of items which basically started contributing to the inflation. And here you find that the rural inflation numbers are much higher compared to the urban inflation numbers in most of the places. So this window, the starting from November 14 to November 15, the inflation numbers, rural inflation numbers were higher. Then it went down and now it is up. Okay. And then let's look back to around 100 and the last period, that is 108 months from now, which is the starting from the January 14, where do we find any difference? Oh, the vegetable prices here are very high. Look at this. And interestingly, the vegetable prices as far as urban is concerned is low. The rural contribution of vegetable prices to the overall inflation was very high in the initial part of the window. So we see, from a policy point of view, these things have to be looked into, and we have to take proactive action so as to prevent such kind of occurrences. Because if you are able to prevent such occurrences to happen, where a particular commodity contributes significantly to the overall index, that is not good, because those things can be fixed in advance. We have to take some actions of storage or something like that we have to do in order to contain inflation, the overall inflation, because inflation impacts the lives of the common man, right? It impacts the man who is basically at the bottom of the pyramid. So we have to take those into consideration. So friends, this is in short the overall picture of inflation. I thought that you probably have appreciated this video, and if you find anything interesting and anything which I missed, which to call out in this video, please let me know in the comment section, and I will come back to you with another video in another point of time with an interesting topic. And thank you very much for your patient listening. Thank you very much.